Now those who were arrested will return, and two Russias will look each other in the eye, the one that sent these people to the camps and the one that came back." With these words, the poet Akhmatova anticipated the drama which unfolded as prisoners returned from the camps to confront the colleagues, neighbours, friends who had informed on them. In 1954, Maria Butkiewicz came back to the communal apartment in Leningrad where she had lived with her brother and their parents until their arrest in 1937. Their 2 rooms had been taken over by the next-door neighbours, a married couple with 3 children. The wife had been on very friendly terms with the Butkiewiczes until the mass arrests of 1937, when she denounced them as counter-revolutionaries and foreign spies. Maria's father was of Polish origin. She had even claimed that Maria's mother was a prostitute who brought clients to the house. In 1954, the same woman, now grown old and thin with long white hair, was living in the rooms, her children having grown up and left the apartment, and her husband sent to a labour camp in 1941. Maria needed the woman to sign a document testifying to the fact that her family used to live there. She had recently received the rehabilitation of her parents, who had both been shot in 1937, and needed the document to apply for compensation for the living space and personal property which had been confiscated from the Butkiewiczes at the time of their arrest. The woman's face went white when she heard Maria say her name. "I didn't think you would come back," she said. Maria explained the purpose of her visit and reassured the woman that she had no intention of making any claim to her living space. The woman invited Maria to sit down while she read and signed the document. Maria looked around the room. She recognized her mother's collection of ceramic pots, the leather sofa which her father had brought back from Minsk, cushions, lamps, and chairs familiar to her from her childhood. When she had signed the document, the woman asked Maria to sit down with her on the sofa. "There is something I must tell you," she whispered. The woman told Maria that shortly after his arrest, her husband had written her a letter from the labour camp, which she had destroyed out of fear. He had written to tell her that during his interrogation they had knocked out all his teeth, that he did not think he would return from the labour camp, and that she should not wait for him, but should marry someone else. Her husband never returned from the labour camps. She was telling Maria this, she explained, because she wanted her to understand that she had suffered too, and that she was sorry about what had happened to her parents. Yuri Stackelberg was arrested in 1948 on charges of belonging to a group of Jewish nationalist students at Leningrad University. It was claimed that the group was organized and financed by a German baron as a spy ring against the Soviet Union. Yuri was accused of trying to set up a secret printing press to spread anti-Soviet propaganda in the university. The charges had no foundation. They were based entirely on a made-up story and denunciation signed by 4 of his fellow students at the university who, it seems, were motivated largely by their xenophobia and had picked on Stackelberg because of his foreign name. It is also possible that they knew about the arrest of Yuri's father for disseminating German propaganda in December 1941. In March 1949, Yuri was sentenced by a court in Leningrad to 25 years of hard labour. He was sent to the Bamlag camp where his father had perished in 1942 and put to work building bridges for the railway. In 1956, he was seriously injured from a fall and released as an invalid. At first, he lived in Luga, and then finally he returned to Leningrad, taking a job in the public library. When Yuri was invited by the KGB to look at the records of his trial, he saw the names of his fellow students who had reported him. He paid a visit to each one in turn. "They all understood that I knew what they had done," recalls Yuri. One woman told me that it made no difference that I had returned, that it changed nothing, because I had been a bastard then, and I was a bastard now. She said that I should have been shot. One of the men, the one who had always been a provocateur, and a stupid one at that, took me to his home, and in the entrance showed me a large bundle of paper. It was the sort of consignment that was sometimes sold in the big shops. He said, "If you want some, help yourself. Perhaps now's the time to start your printing press." I laughed it off, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I thought of telling him that the paper was of no use for a printing press because it was cut too small. But I said nothing. Ibrahim Ismailzadeh was a senior professor of medicine and a departmental head at the Institute of Medicine in Baku at the time of his arrest in 1938 on charges of belonging to an anti-Soviet group of Azerbaijani nationalists. After his release from the Kolyma camps, he returned to Baku, where he took up a junior position in the same institute. Instead of the cutting-edge research he had done in the 1930s, he was now employed in routine clinical work. During the trial of M.D. Bagirov, the former party boss of Azerbaijan, in 1955, Ibrahim appeared as a witness for the prosecution, in which capacity he was allowed to look at his own file from 1938, when Bagirov had led the terror campaign in Baku. Ibrahim discovered that he had been denounced by his favourite student, who had since gone on to become the head of his department at the institute. While Ibrahim was in Kolyma, the former student had often visited his wife and daughter, who treated him as a member of the family. The old student was noticeably cooler in his behaviour after Ibrahim's return, rarely coming to the house, and never in the evening, when he would have been obliged to eat or drink with him. After his discovery of the denunciation, Ibrahim and his family were forced to see the former student several times, and while they never spoke to him about his actions, it was clear that the Ismailzadehs now knew of the betrayal. One day, the political director of the institute appeared at the Ismailzadeh house. He wanted Ibrahim to sign a document stating that his family had no grievance against the former student and that they would remain on friendly terms. Ibrahim refused to sign. He had to be restrained from throwing the official out on the street. According to his daughter, Ibrahim was crushed by the betrayal. He felt humiliated at being forced to work beneath someone who, he felt, was hardly qualified. Being asked to sign the document had been the final straw. In 1953, Kolya Kuzmin, the former leader of the Komsomol in Obuchovo, who had denounced the Golovins as kulaks during the collectivization campaign of 1930, came to live in Piestevo, the small town near Vologda, where the Golovins had settled after their return from exile in Siberia. Before his denunciation of the Golovins, Kolya had often been a guest in their house. He had even been employed in the leather workshop of Nikolai Golovin, who had taken pity on the teenage boy because he came from the poorest family in the village. Nikolai and his wife Yevdokia were religious believers. When Kolya came to visit them shortly after Stalin's death and asked for their forgiveness, not just for his denunciation, but for his part in the murder of Nikolai's brother, they not only forgave him, but invited him to come and live with them in Piestevo. Their daughter, Antonina, who was then working as a doctor in Kolpino near Leningrad, took exception to her parents' generosity and tried to persuade them to change their minds. "He killed Ivan, Nikolai's brother, and destroyed our family. How can one forgive a man for that?" she reasoned. But Yevdokia believed that a truly Christian person should forgive his enemies. Kolya settled in a house next door to the Golovins. He was ashamed of his actions in the past and tried to make amends by running errands for the Golovins. On Saturdays he would go with Nikolai to the public baths. On Sundays he would go with both of them to church. In 1955, Yevdokia died, followed 3 years later by Nikolai, and in 1970 by Kolya Kuzmin. They are all buried in the same churchyard in Piestevo. Many former prisoners were surprisingly forgiving towards the people who had informed on them. This inclination to forgive was seldom rooted in religious attitudes, as it was with the Golovins, but it was often based on the understanding, which was shared by everyone who had experienced the prisons and the camps of the Gulag system, that virtually any citizen, no matter how good they might be in normal circumstances, could be turned into an informer by pressure from the NKVD. The journalist Irina Shcherbakova recalls a meeting of the Moscow Memorial Society established to represent the victims of repression during the late 1980s. One woman, who had been arrested in about 1939, said to me in a completely calm voice, "Over there is the man who informed on me," and she greeted him quite normally. Catching my perplexed expression, she explained, "Of course we were just 18 then. His parents were old Bolsheviks who were repressed, and they, the NKVD, tried to recruit me too. And of course he himself was repressed later on." I felt that what she said was motivated not by a lack of concern for the past or a desire to forget it, but by the realization of the shameful things the system had done to people. That realization was certainly more likely to develop in the 1980s, when painful memories had perhaps softened over time, and the victims of repression, informed by history, had arrived at a more objective understanding of the Soviet system. But the tendency to refrain from the condemnation of individuals was already noted in the 1950s, when Soviet émigrés apparently were not hostile to ordinary party functionaries because they understood that they were really powerless and perhaps themselves victims of the same system. Not surprisingly, the return of Stalin's prisoners provoked great fear in the people who had helped to send them to the camps. All the murderers, provocateurs and informers had one feature in common, recalls Nadezhda Mandelstam. They never thought that their victims might return one day. They thought that everybody sent to the next world or to the camps had been eliminated once and for all. It never entered their heads that these ghosts might rise up and call their grave diggers to account. During the period of rehabilitations, therefore, they were utterly panic-stricken. They thought that time had gone into reverse, and that those they had dubbed camp dust had suddenly once more taken on flesh and reassumed their names. They were seized by terror. One wretched woman informer was constantly summoned to the prosecutor's office to retract testimony she had given against the living and the dead. After every session, recalls Mandelstam, she would run to the families of those she had denounced and plead, as God was her witness, that she had never said anything bad about them, and that her only reason for going to the prosecutor's office now was to say good things about all the dead people so they would be cleared as soon as possible. Mandelstam concluded that the woman had never had anything remotely resembling a conscience, but this was more than she could stand, and she had a stroke that left her paralyzed. She must at some moment have got so scared that she really believed these rehabilitations were serious, and that all the slanderers and other minions might be brought to trial. Mandelstam also tells the story of a senior MVD official in Tashkent who was pensioned off after Stalin's death, but occasionally summoned to interviews with former victims who had by some miracle survived and returned from the camps. The man could not stand it and hanged himself. Mandelstam was able to read a draft of the suicide letter he addressed to the Central Committee. The official wrote that he had always worked hard for the party, and that it had never crossed his mind that he might have been serving not the people, but some kind of Bonapartism. He tried to put the blame on others, on the people he had interrogated for signing all kinds of bogus confessions, thereby misleading the officials in charge of their cases, on the officials sent from Moscow with instructions concerning simplified interrogation procedures and demands that the quotas be fulfilled, and last but not least, on the informers who volunteered the denunciations which forced the secret police to act against so many people. The death of the MVD official was hushed up. He had named too many functionaries and informers before his suicide. But his daughter was determined to get even with those who had caused her father's death. As Mandelstam noted, her anger was directed against the ones who had stirred up this nightmarish business. They should have shown some consideration for the people in official positions at the time. They didn't start all this. They were just carrying out orders. Another one of Stalin's henchmen to commit suicide was Alexander Fadeev, the alcoholic leader of the Writers' Union, who was removed from that post in 1954. Fadeev had been suffering from depression for a long time, but Stalin's death completely unhinged him. "My illness is not in my liver," he wrote to a fellow union member. "It is in my mind." Fadeev confessed to Simonov that he was bankrupt as a writer. He gave up working on his last novel, a socialist realist tale about the party's struggle against industrial sabotage, which made use of materials from the 1930s trials, after he had realized, as he explained to several friends, that its moral import was completely wrong. There had been no industrial sabotage. Fadeev was overcome by feelings of remorse for his part in the repression of writers during his leadership of the Writers' Union. "I was such a scoundrel," he wrote to Chukovsky. He was particularly remorseful about his old friend Yogan Altman, who died in 1955, 2 years after his release from jail. Fadeev had denounced Altman during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign and had done nothing to save his friend when he was arrested and imprisoned in 1949. After Altman's death, Fadeev went on a drinking binge. He confessed to a friend that he had sanctioned the arrest of many writers he had known were innocent. After 1953, Fadeev attempted to redeem himself by petitioning the authorities for the release and rehabilitation of writers who had been sent to the labor camps. He wrote to Malenkov and Khrushchev, calling on the party to loosen its ideological control of the cultural sphere. But he was ignored and then removed from his leadership position. By 1956, Fadeev had become an isolated figure, widely denounced as an unreconstructed Stalinist by the literary intelligentsia, which knew nothing of his later efforts on behalf of repressed writers. Just before he shot himself on the 13th of May 1956, Fadeev wrote a letter to the Central Committee, which remained hidden in the party archives until 1990. "I see no possibility of living any longer, because the cause of Soviet art to which I gave my life has been destroyed by the arrogant and ignorant leadership of the party. Our best writers have been exterminated or died before their time because of the criminal connivance of those in power. As a writer, my own life has lost all sense, and it is with joy, with a sense of liberation from this vile existence, where the soul is crushed by malice, lies, and slander, that I depart this life." Fadeev was broken by the conflict between being a good communist and being a good human being. He was, by nature, a kind person, as many of his victims recognized, but his conscience, his identity, and, in the end, his will to live, were gradually destroyed by the compromises and accommodations he had made in his many years of service to the Stalinist regime. Despite Fadeev's pessimism about the state of literature, Soviet writers played a leading role in the beginning of the thaw. As the regime ceased to exercise a direct veto over writers, literature became the focus for a new emphasis on the individual and private life, and on the rejection of the meddling interference of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Soviet writers moved away from the public themes and heroes of socialist realism and strove to portray real people in their domestic and social context. The most daring work of fiction in those years, Ehrenburg's the Thaw 1954 was deliberately provocative, as if it were a test to see how far it was possible to go in the new climate. The novel tells the story of a despotic factory boss, a little Stalin who becomes increasingly corrupt and inhumane, stealing money assigned for workers' housing to invest in the factory, as he struggles to fulfill the production quotas of the 5-year plan. The boss's wife cannot bear to stay with such a heartless man, and the spring thaw, which promises a new and better life, gives her the courage to leave him. In the political climate of 1954, when the thaw had only just begun, it was too early for Soviet readers to discuss the novel's anti-Stalinism, which was not obvious in any case. Instead, they concentrated on the novel's other theme, the independence of the artist, which was contained in its subplot about a painter. The artist churns out works to order by the state and lives comfortably as a consequence, but he recognizes his own mediocrity compared with other painters whose art has not been compromised by service to the system. The publication of The Thaw split the Soviet literary world. Liberal journals such as Novy Mir, where the novel was first published, hoped it would mark the start of a new era, when writers could at last be honest and sincere, when they would return to their true role of shaping private sensibilities rather than reflecting the interests of the regime. In a discussion of his work at a Moscow library in 1954, Ehrenburg maintained that the purpose of art was to express the culture of emotions and help the individual understand his fellow human beings. Alarmed by all this liberal talk, conservatives in the Soviet establishment began to organize a series of attacks on the liberal writers of the Thaw. In August 1954, they secured the dismissal of Tvardovsky, the kulak son and poet, from the post of editor of Novy Mir. The task of criticizing Ehrenburg fell to Simonov, who replaced Tvardovsky as the editor of Novy Mir. Simonov was chosen because he was regarded as a moderate conservative and therefore more authoritative than Stalinist hardliners such as Sofronov. In 2 long articles in Literaturnaya Gazeta, Simonov attacked the Thaw, arguing that its portrayal of Soviet Russia was too dark and that the conclusion of its subplot was simplistic. It was possible, Simonov argued, to be a good artist and to serve the state. Simonov remained in the Stalinist camp until 1956, when he began to embrace the spirit of reform. Like many people who had lived in Stalin's shadow, Simonov was confused and disoriented by the leader's death. At first, it was far from clear which way Kremlin politics would go. A return to the terror was quite plausible. In this climate of uncertainty, it was not unreasonable for people in positions such as Simonov's to play it safe by sticking to the political ground they had occupied before Stalin died. In those years, recalls Simonov, my attitude to Stalin kept changing. I wavered between various emotions and points of view. For much of 1953, his main feeling was a profound sense of grief at the loss of a great man, which led Simonov to write a startling eulogy in Literaturnaya Gazeta, The Sacred Duty of the Writer, in which he argued that it was the highest task of Soviet literature to portray the greatness and the genius of the immortal Stalin for all nations and all future generations. The article enraged Khrushchev, who insisted on Simonov's removal from the newspaper's staff. Simonov remained loyal to his Stalinist origins throughout 1954, placing a portrait of Stalin on his desk. It was a picture he particularly liked. Stalin gazing on that monument to Gulag labor, the Volga-Don Canal. During Stalin's lifetime, Simonov had never hung a portrait of the ruler in his office or his house. He did so now because he was repulsed by the turncoats and careerists who had proclaimed their love for the Soviet leader when he was alive, but renounced him as soon as he was dead. It was not Stalinism that inspired me to display the photograph, recalls Simonov, but something closer to the noble or intelligentsia idea of honor. This same refusal to renounce his past led Simonov in 1955 to include in a collection of his verse a truly awful ode to Stalin that he had written in 1943 but not published, in which he praised the Soviet leader as the greatest human being in the whole of history. Simonov followed his critique of Ehrenburg with a series of attacks on other writers in the vanguard of the liberal Thaw. In a major Pravda article in July 1954, Simonov decried the literary rejection of the traditions of socialist realism and the growing trend towards satire, singling out for criticism the Ukrainian dramatist Alexandra Korneichuk for abandoning the theatre's responsibility, as Simonov defined it, to teach the Soviet people how to love and cherish the Soviet system. As the editor of Novy Mir, Simonov was also critical of Vladimir Dudintsev's explosive novel Not by Bread Alone, submitted to the journal for publication in serial form. The novel tells the story of an inventor, a physics teacher dedicated to the betterment of life in the Soviet Union, whose creativity is stifled and destroyed by the petty corruption and inefficiency of Soviet officialdom. Simonov forced Dudintsev to tone down his attack on the bureaucracy, fearing that the novel might raise doubts about the system as a whole, before he published it in Novy Mir in 1956. Despite the changes demanded by Simonov, the book was still hailed by the reformers as a battering ram against the establishment. The first public discussion of the novel drew so many people to the Writers' Union, with students climbing water pipes to listen to the debate from the windows on the second floor, that mounted police had to be called in to disperse the crowds. Simonov was also responsible for Novy Mir's crucial decision not to publish Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. In September 1956, he wrote to Pasternak on behalf of the journal's editorial board, outlining their political objections to his novel, an epic human drama set against the background of the Revolution and the Civil War. The letter was used and prominently cited by the Soviet leadership in 1958 during its campaign to force Pasternak to turn down the award of the Nobel Prize. Smuggled out of the Soviet Union and first published in Italy in 1957, Dr. Zhivago became an international bestseller, and Pasternak was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958. But under pressure from the Writers' Union and a storm of nationalist abuse against him in the Soviet press, he was forced to refuse the prize. Simonov had a very low opinion of the novel, a vile and spiteful work of Philistinism and, in places, simply anti-Soviet, as he described it in a letter to his son. Simonov took the view that, in posing the central question of his novel, whether the Russian intelligentsia had made the right decision to accept the October Revolution of 1917, Pasternak had set things up so that it could only be answered in the negative. That, by deciding to go along with the Bolsheviks, the intelligentsia had betrayed their duty to the Russian people, to Russian culture and humanity. In Simonov's opinion, not only did this bias make the novel anti-Soviet, it was also an insult to a whole generation of professionals, to people like his mother and his stepfather, who had remained in Soviet Russia and worked for the Bolsheviks, not out of political choice, but because they were Russian patriots, first and foremost. As the Thaw developed, and Khrushchev's reformers gained the upper hand in the Soviet leadership, Simonov became an increasingly isolated figure in the Moscow literary world. The liberal spirit of reform was not tolerant of Stalinist believers who refused to change their views. As Simonov put it in 1956, "The editor can ask to cut away the name of Stalin from my verse, but he cannot help me with the Stalin who is left within my soul." It was only very gradually, after Khrushchev's speech denouncing Stalin at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, that Simonov began to purge that inner Stalin from himself. Khrushchev's speech was a crucial watershed, more important than the death of Stalin in the slow demise of the terror system that had ruled the Soviet people since 1917. With Khrushchev's speech, it became clear that the Soviet government was finally distancing itself from Stalin's reign of terror, and the people's fear and uncertainty about the future gradually began to lift. The 20th Party Congress, the first since Stalin's death, convened in the Great Kremlin Palace on the 14th of February 1956. The 1,355 voting delegates assembled in the expectation that the leadership would at last explain its post-Stalin line and clarify the status of the dead leader. The decision to expose and denounce Stalin's crimes was made by the collective leadership, though there were bitter arguments about how far they should go, following the report by a special commission on the repression of party members between 1935 and 1940 presented to the Central Committee on the 9th of February. The leadership was surprised by the commission's findings, both by the huge scale of the mass arrests and executions and by the fabrication of the evidence on which this wave of terror had been based. And on the eve of the Party Congress it resolved to tell the truth to a closed and secret session of its delegates. The text of the speech was prepared collectively, and Khrushchev, who had been the main driving force behind disclosure, took responsibility for its delivery on the 25th of February. Khrushchev's motives were complex. It was certainly courageous to argue for disclosure when other party leaders such as Kaganovich, Molotov and Voroshilov were clearly uncomfortable with the idea of exposing the crimes of a regime in which they had played such important roles. During the discussions on the 9th of February, Khrushchev called for bold action. What sort of leader destroys everyone? We have to be courageous and tell the truth. We all worked with Stalin, but that does not implicate us. As the facts emerge, we have to speak of them, otherwise we are justifying his actions. We can speak with a clear voice. We are not ashamed. We have nothing to fear and no reason to be satisfied by small-minded arguments. Disclosure also suited Khrushchev's bid for power. He used the exposure of Stalin's crimes to undermine or threaten his main rivals for the leadership, and to build a base of support in those sectors of society that embraced the Thaw and political reform. But above all, perhaps, like the rest of the party leaders, Khrushchev feared that if they did not speak of Stalin's crimes, the public would speak in their place, and that, in the climate of the Thaw, critics of the party would hold the entire leadership responsible. Either you tell them at the upcoming Congress, or you will find yourself under investigation, Khrushchev was warned by an old party comrade recently returned from the labour camps, whose testimony featured in his speech. By giving the impression that the party leaders had discovered the truth about the terror only recently, as a result of the commission which reported on the 9th of February, Khrushchev was able to shift the blame onto Stalin and clear the other leaders from suspicion on the grounds that they did not know. To the same end, Khrushchev offered a rather exculpatory explanation of the injustices committed by the party since 1935. Stalin was held personally responsible for all of them, but other party leaders were portrayed as victims of his monstrous crimes. Even the followers of Trotsky and Bukharin had not deserved to die. There was no question of blaming the Soviet system, only of struggling to overcome the cult of personality. The whole purpose of the speech was to restore Leninism to power. Khrushchev ended his speech with a plea for secrecy. This subject must not go beyond the borders of the party, let alone reach the press. That is why we are talking about this at a closed session. We must not provide ammunition for our enemies. We must not bear our injuries to them. I assume Congress delegates will understand this and act accordingly. After he had finished speaking, there was a deathly silence in the conference hall. Alexander Yakovlev, later to become a leading figure in Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, was one of the Congress delegates. He recalls the scene. I sat in the balcony. I remember well the sense of profound disturbance, if not desperation, which took hold of me after Khrushchev spoke. The silence in the hall was profound. There was no sound of squeaking chairs, no coughing, no whispering. No one looked at anyone, whether from the unexpectedness of what had just occurred or from nervousness and fear. We left the conference hall with our heads bowed. Among the delegates who spilled out into the entranceway was Simonov, who stood there for a long time in a state of shock and confusion, smoking and talking with Igor Chernyutsyn, the Central Committee's cultural advisor. "We already knew a lot," recalls Chernyutsyn, "but we were stunned by the way the truth caved in on us." But was it the whole truth?